Thank you very much, and I really do appreciate being here. This is my first Fortfest, Fortean, gathering that I've actually been at or spoken at. Although I have to say that I have been aware of Charles Fort and his work for a very long time, and have written, I guess both written a very long time ago, but also read various issues of what is the. I don't want to lose a lot of time here, but there's an international, isn't there a Fortean magazine out of England?
Yes.
Fortean Times. Is that the same organ? Well, it's the same Charles Fort. I don't know if it's actually part of your organization, but I have been aware for a long time. Now I'll put in a commercial plug right now. Remember to buy a copy of this. Why? Because it benefits your organization. And I'd be happy to sign them, et cetera. So yes, I have a very serious interest in things like the parapsychology. Parapsychology, the book is called The Parapsychology Revolution, it's an anthology. And I don't know, I have a diverse number of interests, but I'm not going to talk about all of them today. I'm going to focus really on the core of my research when it comes to looking at ancient civilizations and give you a brief rundown on that. And most of the people here, I believe, are new to me in the sense that, how many people have never heard me speak before? Yeah, the vast majority. So there's a couple of you that have before, but a couple of you happen to be fellow presenters, for instance. So I'm not going to worry about you guys. The people like Micah Hanks, who you'll be hearing from tomorrow, or Larry, we met recently. So you'll see some familiar things, but the majority of people have not. So let me jump right into it. Also, one other thing before I get finished with sort of introductory things. Again, it's a pleasure to be here, especially after our drive down last night. When I say our drive, Katie Ulysses is standing in the corner there, and this is my wife, and I'll mention her now because she's been an integral part of this research, and I want to make that very clear. And a lot of the photographs you'll see, for instance, from Turkey and Easter Island, are her work. She designed the cover of my book, etc. So I'm saying all that now, so if I don't mention her again, I want you to know who's behind a lot of this, because that really is serious. Okay, so let me talk about ancient civilization, and I call this right now, you can call it different titles, but I've got up there the Antiquity of Civilization, Rethinking the Paradigm. And I think that's a lot of us are doing, and I feel that was really Charles Fort in many ways, was knocking the old paradigms, or questioning the old paradigms, questioning the assumptions. I think in every talk we've had today so far, that has been one of the themes. And a practical thing, are you hearing echo? It's just the room, okay. My hearing is not great, and I didn't know if I was doing something wrong. Also, yeah, do we have to do so? I can't do anything about the volume. Maybe you can help me with that. I'll keep talking as he tries this. Does that sound a little bit better? Yeah, okay. Okay, and also, if you want to look at later, I'll point this out now because I tend to run out of time and things get rushed at the end. We have a website, www.robertshoch.com. Please go to it later if you have any interest in my work and research, and you'll also see little blurbs or little things I posted, for instance, on my work on parapsychology and other topics that I can't get to today. Or if you're interested in visiting some of these sites, there are some trips planned, and we have people like Jennifer Stein who has traveled with me, and I think will attest that we have a very good time. So please look into that if you're interested. So let me jump right into it. I am an academic. I still consider myself an academic, despite what some of my fellow academics may want to think or what they would like to wish would happen to me. And I wish I could just joke about that, but it's not a joke for some of them. They really would like to see me go away, but I'll talk about that some other time in more detail. But I graduated from Yale University. I have a PhD in geology and geophysics, and I got it in 1983, so you can sort of see how old I am. And I went directly after Yale. Well, I actually spent a year at the Peabody Museum at Yale as a special assistant to the director, which basically means that he picked my brain and I helped him with research because I didn't find a job right away outside of Yale. And then after that, I went to Boston University as a full-time faculty member. I was tenured, and I've been there ever since. So that's my brief background. And my serious studies of antiquity really began in 1990 when I went to Egypt, and I first started by working on the Great Sphinx. And this is myself back in the early 1990s, and this is a man named John Anthony West. Some of you have heard of him? Yes. He's a very close and dear friend right now at this point. Well, I mean, we got to get to know each other very quickly, but he got me involved in all of this directly. Although I won't go into it now, I actually have background in, I always loved ancient history and antiquity, and I always thought there was something weird, something wrong, something a little strange, in part because my grandmother was a theosophist. People know theosophy, so there's lots of little things that tie together, but you can ask me later. Standard paradigm for the origins of civilization. We learned this as undergraduates. When I say we, I and my cohort, it's still taught. Learned as graduate students. Much of it was based on the work that was espoused by a guy named V. Gordon Childe. Depending on what you think of him, the great archaeologist, or maybe, villainous archaeologist, but of the early 20th century. And he really put together the standard paradigm, sort of the evolutionary paradigm, that humanity goes through some basic fundamental stages. We start out as savages, then we graduate to barbarism, in a technical sense, the barbarians, because they have some cultivations, they have some agriculture, they have villages, and then you have ultimately, it's a progression. You rise to the level of full civilization. And full civilization, you can recognize it by its monumental architecture, usually of stone. It's a sophisticated technology, it's advanced culture, literacy, has cities, and this does not occur until about 4,000 to 3,000 BC. We can say about 3,500 BC. That's the earliest civilization according to standard paradigm. You find in Mesopotamia. Everyone knows where Mesopotamia is? Yeah, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And really in middle and southern Mesopotamia. And to this day, many classical archaeologists really have this paradigm, and a paradigm is more ingrained in many ways when you don't acknowledge it, and they don't acknowledge it to this day. It's just tacit, it's underlying their work, and if you push things back before about 4,000, 5,000 BC, just to give it a little extra, well, it can't be civilization by definition. It can't exist. They're a bunch of hunters and gatherers. They're a bunch of savages. They don't have high technology. They're not sophisticated. They don't have civilization. Sometimes it's expressed in an evolutionary sense. We've all seen something like this. Yeah, and it's always, primitive, old, ape-type things, and we eventually progress to, modern, not just modern Homo sapiens, and we've heard something about Bigfoot and whatnot, but sophisticated, civilization. Of course, Plato, you've heard of Plato? And the ancients in general, and Plato was simply at the end of the classical period, but really talking about what people had been talking about. When I say people now, classical civilizations, or the dynastic Egyptians, had been talking about for a long time, that they had a very different view, that no, there were civilizations before the classical period. There were civilizations before what we moderns, or when I say we moderns, the modern typical historians, conventional archaeologists and historians nowadays would say is the emergence of civilization. They talked about earlier civilizations. So one way to talk about this is Atlantis. When I was a young faculty member first investigating the Sphinx in Egypt in the early 1990s, I drove John Anthony West crazy because I would not say the word Atlantis. Why? Because if you were looking for Atlantis or associated with anything to do with Atlantis, you were immediately made fun of in the academic community. But in fact, I would say this is the concept of Atlantis. Do people know when Plato dated Atlantis to? Put it into our modern chronology.
About 10,000 BC?
Yeah, about 10,000 BC, roughly 9,600 BC, a lot of people will say, because it says it was 9,000 years earlier than when his predecessor, relative of his, actually got this story from Egypt. So actually keep that in mind, 9,600 or so BC. It's a very important date, as we'll see. Also, Atlantis was built in what? Circles. The actual city. There's a city of Atlantis and then sort of the nation of Atlantis. The Egyptians, ancient Egyptians too, talked about an earlier time, earlier civilization before the last round of civilization, which has culminated with us today, but that there were earlier cycles of civilization. They had the term Zeptepi, basically for the first time or the time of creation, the beginning of their civilization. You've heard of Gold Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. Very common concept around the globe. It's not just a Western concept or just a Hindu concept, but it's found even in the Americas. The Egyptians were talking about things like this. So, but that's all nonsense, correct? Because what did the ancient people know about ancient people? So the paradigm that I grew up with as a undergraduate and graduate student was you have the rise of civilization about 3,500 BC. The Sphinx is carved de novo about 2,500 BC. That was it. End of story. Egyptologists, historians know everything. All you have to do is, fill in a few little details. You can argue over exact years of when certain pharaohs reigned. Was it this year or 2 years later or 2 years earlier? But the broad outlines have been established. That's what I was taught. That's what many people still believe. But this chronology has problems, and that's where I got involved. And the standard paradigm for the antiquity of civilization really began to open up, to crack for me in 1990, because that's my first trip to Egypt. Now, some 24 years ago. That's me. You recognize me? Always wear my gloves so I don't get burned. I worry about burning, whether it's spontaneous combustion or otherwise. And that's John Anthony West. Of course, both of us in our younger years, about 24 years ago. Located on the Giza Plateau, this is the Sphinx. This is actually, recognize me? Just for scale. This is a later picture. You can tell I have the beard. But the Sphinx is sitting on the plateau. And something I want to point out very carefully right now is, do you see the Sphinx's paws? No. Trick question. So you're like my students. They're covered over. Do you see how they're covered over? Little blocks in repair. So you see the gloves on the Sphinx. But here is the original body of the Sphinx, but you see how heavily weathered it is? And the Sphinx itself is carved out of bedrock. The Sphinx itself is all one massive piece of bedrock, carved from bedrock. Yes, the head looks a little bit different, but that is continuous rock there. This is actually cement filled in modern times. But what is very important is to carve the body of the Sphinx, they had to carve down into the bedrock. Only the head of the Sphinx was originally above the level of the plateau, and the rest is carved down. So here maybe you can see a little bit better. Do you see how it's in the Sphinx enclosure? And it faces due east. This is the second pyramid, not the Great Pyramid. Everyone should be able to recognize that. If you go to Egypt with me, you'll never mistake them again. I once saw a book on the Great Pyramid, and the cover, they had the second pyramid. I couldn't believe it. But it faces due east. Now, when they carved the Sphinx, they didn't just chip out the rock and, make powder and take it out in baskets? No, they did it the hard way. They carved out multi-ton blocks tens of tons in weight, and they reassembled them here in front of the Sphinx in what is now known the Sphinx Temple, as the Sphinx Temple. So this is incredibly sophisticated. And it's not just me saying this as a geologist. There was another geologist, Tom Agner, who some years ago did a master's thesis looking at this, and as he described it, and I concur, it's like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, but the strata, the layers of rock are very definitive. You can actually figure out where many of these blocks go back into that enclosure, so there's no doubt about this, the level of sophistication and technical difficulty of what they were doing. So keep that in mind, because that temple is as old as the core body of the Sphinx, which is older than the traditional date. Here's the Sphinx, just to give you a feel for it, in the pyramids, faces due east in front of the second pyramid. There, can you see how it's carved out of the bedrock? And the blocks were taken, as I said, to build the temples in front. There's just another view to give you the orientation. Who has not been to Egypt? Oh, most of you. So you have to come with me. I'm serious. Go to the website, and you'll see the next trip that's planned. So the core body and the walls, this I noticed immediately. When I first saw the Sphinx in person, I noticed two things immediately. One, can you guess what they were? The water erosion, yes, because I'm a geologist, and it made absolutely no sense that you would have this type of very clear definitive, as more than one professional geologist and Means has said to me, it's very clear, it's very definitive, it's just textbook sort of geology 101, that is water runoff precipitation. And just to make sure it's clear now, it's not from rising Nile floods. Rising Nile floods would give a different type of erosional and weathering pattern. It would give undercutting, etc. No, it's not from that. It's from water beating down, runoff, that type of thing. Yet this is the edge of the Sahara Desert, hyper-arid desert for the last 5,000 or so years. So there's an incompatibility here. When the body of the Sphinx was carved, when they cut out all these multi-ton blocks and built the temple, had to be in pre-Sahara times, pre-3000 BC, pre-dynastic times. This is something that the Egyptologists, guess, multiple choice, wanted to hear and were enthusiastic about. I won't even go to the next one. They wanted to, they were hoping I would spontaneously combust. If I didn't, they were hoping they could get a hold of me and somehow legally tie me to the stake and light the fire. What was the other thing? I mentioned those two things immediately. What was the second thing? Someone guess.
The head was different time than the body.
Yeah, the head is different than the body. It's too small for the body. It's actually out of proportion. You don't see it here so well, but the head I immediately knew, and I don't mean psychically, I mean, from a geologist's point of view, that is not the original head on the body. It's too small. It shows different weathering features, and I was convinced immediately, not that I had proved it yet or demonstrated it yet, but that this was a new head. It was recarved, which made immediate sense to me too, because if the body was so weathered, so heavily weathered by water, wouldn't the head have been damaged too? Yes, but I think they took a larger damaged head and recarved it, whereas for the paws, for instance, they've tried to cover it over and repair it. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah, so that's not the original head. So we can call it a Sphinx, but I suspect it was a lion, a male lion originally. And this just shows some pictures. Everyone see it? That's the Sphinx. That's a person. And this shows wind erosion versus rain erosion, just diagrammatically. We did, in 1993, it was aired on NBC, an Emmy-winning NBC documentary. If you've never seen it, I'm told it's on Netflix now. Although the version that's circulating now on Netflix and whatnot is an expanded version. It's not the original NBC version, so it includes other things which how should I say, I don't necessarily agree with all the details of, for instance, I think Richard Hoagland, people know him. He's a friend, I like him a lot. That doesn't mean I need to agree with him on everything. You see what I mean? But the original NBC version I preferred, which was shorter and more compact and more focused. But Charlton Heston was actually really into this. Why Charlton Heston? Moses, yeah, of course, he was Moses. Yeah. And here you can see the rock layers. Rock comes in layers, at least these types of rocks. Limestone serve like a layer cake or a pie, and different layers erode out differently, and then you get the fissures. But the softer layers get scoured out by the wind. You see that there? Versus the rain precipitation. So it was all very definitive. This shows wind. This is what you would expect if the Sphinx were just 2500 BC. This is on the Giza Plateau. These are exactly the same rocks as the Sphinx is carved out of. These are supposedly, according to Egyptologists, contemporary to the original Sphinx. This is impossible, that this and the Sphinx are the same age. Zahi Hawass, have people heard of him? Yeah. Zahi Hawass, the famous former, I don't know what his position is now, but he used to be in charge of all antiquities in Egypt. He got some Cairo University geologists to go, and they were supposed to go to the plateau and say that these were not the same rocks as the rocks that the Sphinx are carved out of, and that Shoch was crazy. They were at least honest geologists, because it's pretty simple geology, and they came back with, no, Shoch is actually right. Never heard from them again. Yeah, and of course that was never publicized. But again, it's the suppression of information, the suppression. Have we heard about that already today? Yeah, think of the DNA, right? The Bigfoot DNA, and things don't get published when they don't fit the paradigm, they don't fit what people want to hear. Bottom line is that there's evidence that this was eroded by not wind and sand, but rain and precipitation. We know that North Africa and the Sahara in particular has not always been that hyper-arid. It wasn't always the Sahara Desert. This is from a standard archaeology textbook that I actually used as an undergraduate, still stands, Karl Butzer. And he diagrammed very nicely how, the Sahara goes back to about 3100 BC was his dating for it. Before that was much moisture, much rainier period. So again, this fits into the standard geology. When I present this to geological societies, no problem. It all makes sense. When I present it to Egyptologists, it's a very different story. This cannot be. Go look at rocks somewhere else. We don't want to hear about this one. And the reality is, it doesn't just go back to 4000 BC or 5000 BC, because the level of the weathering and erosion, that takes time. We're talking a meter or more. So my early work suggested that, okay, here's the beginning of civilization. Sphinx goes back to an earlier period. My initial estimate, which I'm no longer happy with, was maybe 5,000 to 7,000 BC. That was sort of pushing the geological data, I admit now, to make the Sphinx as young as possible. So I thought, you don't want to, if you're going to buck the system, you don't want to buck it too much, right? As it turns out, the Egyptologists didn't matter. I could have said 5,000 BC, or I could have said 15,000 BC, or 50,000 BC, and they would have been equally upset, I think. In fact, I think they would have been more upset if I said 50,000 BC, because that would have been what? Even more unbelievable to everyone, then they could try to dismiss me more easily. But I wasn't saying that, because that's not what the data said. I wanted more confirmatory data, though, and I actually never presented any of this publicly, never even talked about until we did a related series of tests which are independent, if you know geology, independent of the surface features, the surface weathering, the climate change on the surface, and that was to do some subsurface seismic tests. So essentially, we used a sledgehammer on a steel plate. This is Tom DeBecke, Dr. Tom DeBecke, who worked with me on this, professional Houston geophysicist. I'm a geologist and geophysicist. He's just I hate to say just, but he specializes on the geophysics aspects. And so essentially what you do, or what we did in this case, is we generated sound waves or energy waves that penetrate the rock. They bounce off the subsurface, the various density layers, and lets us model what's underneath. So we did this. We had a lot of fun with it. That's John Anthony West and Tom DeBecke looking at some of the results. Here it shows, seismic and reflections and refractions and how we did it. I'm not going to go into a bunch of details here, but this is important. This is data. What do you have here? We found that there was a softer layer, if you would, or less dense layer around it, which is what I expected. Because when you uncover rock, it starts to subsurface weather. Okay, it's not erosion. The rock is still there. It's still very hard. You can go to the Sphinx enclosure. If you come with me, you can try this. You can pound your fist on the floor of the enclosure, and if you pound hard enough, you'll still break your bones. You'll break your knuckles. It's not powdered, but the density has changed. There are mineralogical changes, and that's what you expect. Now, the depth of the density changes can allow you to calibrate when was that first uncovered. More or less, when was the Sphinx first carved out? When was the Sphinx temple first built? Make sense to everyone? And you can calibrate this. And if you look at this, you've got 2 meters or so of depth here or more on 3 sides. Along the back, it's much less. Do you see how it's much less here than these other 3? This actually fits something that I was already hypothesizing, is that initially the back of the Sphinx was carved such that it went into the bedrock. It was emerging from the bedrock. This is a depth you would expect if it was about 2500 BC, but this depth around the other 3 sides indicates a much older carving. So this was independent evidence. And to show you diagrammatically, essentially you have much deeper weathering on the 3 sides versus the back. So what I believe was the case is that the back sort of emerged from the bedrock. So this confirmed that the Sphinx, that dates back to that early period. It also confirmed that it was not carved initially as a single complete freestanding sculpture, but was emerging from the bedrock. And here you can you see how this portion, initially it was only carved in the back down to here. And this is where you get that very deep weathering. Everyone see that? Yeah. And you get a very different weathering here. And you can see how it's sort of, as Katie sometimes says, chop, chop. They sort of did a rough job there. This is dynastic. And maybe they lost the meaning of the Sphinx. They were modifying it. They were recarving the head. They ended up carving out the back too. And this allowed me to calibrate the dynastic portion, which matches other dynastic structures that we tested relative to the earliest portions. All make sense? And when you calibrate that, it goes back at least 5,000 BC. But 5,000 BC, not to get real technical, is a calibration where you assume that it keeps weathering at the same rate constantly as it gets deeper. Is that realistic? No, because you've still got all the overburden. So it actually slows down as you get deeper and deeper. So twice as much weathering is not twice as old. It's many times as old. Does that make sense? So that's actually where I admit, in hindsight, when I was young, 20-some years ago, and I was trying not to rock the boat too much, like a little rock, not a big rock, I used a very, very conservative calibration, which is not realistic, and I should have listened to my geological colleagues more at the time, who said basically, you've got to push it back further, at least back to, I would say now, about 10,000 BC or so, based on the actual data. Does that make sense? Yeah, and not try to fudge data just to make it, to push as young as possible, because, then to please the Egyptologists anyway, not that I care about pleasing them. Yeah. So the Sphinx also, I want to make a few points. This is, people know Robert Bauval? I just like to give credit where credit's due. I don't know where he got this from, but he gave this to me. This is a little diagram. What's happening, say 10,000, 9,000, 8,000 BC? It's the age of Leo, if you know about the precessional ages. And the Sphinx would have been facing Leo on the vernal equinox. It faces absolutely due east. It would have seen Leo rising. And how does Leo rise at that time from that position? Out of the bedrock, just as the Sphinx, I believe, was emerging out of the bedrock. Just throw that in. I think it sort of ties in together. So the seismic data really confirms that the Sphinx is old. If I use the most conservative view on the seismic data, I could push it back to 5,000 to 7,000 BC. I was conservative initially. That's what I was trying to say before. If I'm more realistic with the calibration of the seismic data, it pushes it back more to like 9,000 to 11,000 BC, somewhere in that range, which frankly I'm happier with now that we have more data and more confirmatory data. And again, this is the original portion of the Sphinx, not the head, which has been recarved, not the back rump, which has been carved out. This is the western portion, so we refer to that as the western terrace. So that was the bottom line on the Sphinx very quickly. And again, could it go back to the age of Leo? Other seismic details, we did this, and again, we published this in 1991. We actually published this in Geoarcheology, so refereed, professional journal. But what were they? They were mostly geologists, so they didn't know how controversial this was, which is good, right? But something we found anomalies. Don't worry about the high velocity anomaly. It's actually the most interesting to me, but it's a technical geological argument as to why I'm right about the dating. What was interesting to a lot of people is these low velocity anomalies, which you can read as cavity or chamber. And we found a chamber under the left paw. So if you think of the Sphinx facing this way, this is its left paw. This is a sort of probably maybe partially collapsed tunnel-like feature. Do you see that? Labeled B. And then there's a feature back here at the left rump of the Sphinx, C. So this was very interesting. We didn't know about any of these subsurface or underground features on the Sphinx. We put this data together. We give all the data to the Egyptian Antiquities Authority, or whatever the official name was back then. Zahi Hawass looks at it, and two things come out very quickly. Oh, this is nothing new. We already know about this cavity, which it turns out they did. And I've since there's a little block and you can open it up, and yeah, people have been down there. It's probably late period. When I say late period, Greco-Roman, and it's not really that exciting. But they know about. So does that confirm our data? Well, yeah, we didn't know about, so we found it they had already known about, so confirm that we're doing good work, correct? Wouldn't that be logical? Yeah, okay, but he says, oh, that's nothing. We already know about that. And then he says, oh, this is nothing because we know it doesn't exist. Now, and your data is lousy and, can't be. Now, he had no data on it, but I found that almost, you see illogic in the conclusion? Yeah. It's more or less he's saying that they know what they know and data is irrelevant. Because they know this isn't real, they know this is real, and the fact that we happen to find that one means nothing about this one. I'm convinced this is absolutely there, geologically, seismically, geophysically, all the signatures are there. Have they allowed me or anyone else to go in there at this point? No. Now, are there rumors that maybe someone has gone into it, like Zahi Hawass or someone else? Yeah, there's rumors, but I can't confirm or disconfirm. If you go on YouTube, there is one place where, if people know who Mark Lehner is, Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass are here, they're standing around here, and they're drilling in, and they're pulling up just solid limestone core, and then they say, oh, there's no chamber there. Now, why would they even worry about chamber being there? They don't cite me or anything, and they never cite me. They just, oh, there's no chamber there. If you look at, I know how deep that is, they were drilling at the wrong angle, I think absolutely purposefully. Anyway, So there's a chamber. There's a chamber under there. Did anyone know about that before me? Yeah, of course. Edgar Casey knew about this. This was very interesting to me because I was a young faculty member, just been tenured. I didn't do any of this before I was tenured. I'm not stupid. I have some practical sense of things. And I'm sitting in my office. I remember to this day, I get a phone call from the ARE, Association for the Research Research and Enlightenment. Is that it? ARE, the Edgar Casey Foundation, Virginia Beach. It's one of his sons. People have told me which one it must have been, because this was about 1991, 92. Probably, yeah. Yeah. Anyway, he basically told me his father, and I knew who Edgar Casey was, but I didn't know about his predictions about the halls of records and where they were located. But he basically told me I found one of the halls of records. Yeah, I think there were 3 that his father had predicted, one being near or somewhere in the vicinity of the Sphinx, and he was convinced I'd probably found it. About the time that I think his father predicted it would be found. On top of that, but I won't go with it there. Everyone knows who he was, right? The sleeping prophet, that type of thing. And he predicted, and it's there. I'm absolutely convinced it's there. It's not natural. I don't believe it may have started out as a natural cave-type feature, but it's very regular from a seismic geophysical point of view. I was less adamant about this than Thomas DeBecke, the geophysicist I was working with, who on a regular basis would find, he'd be contracted to find underground missile silos and whatnot that they had lost. So he knew what artificial versus natural looked like. He said, yeah, this really looks artificial. The Tutmosis is the 4th stela. This is about 1400 BC. This is erected between the paws of the Sphinx. Why am I mentioning this now? Can you see the Sphinxes? Okay. And how the Sphinx is sort of sitting on the temple? Okay. That chamber we found is under the paws of the Sphinx. The Sphinx doesn't really sit on the Sphinx temple. The Sphinx temple is in front of it. But a lot of people ask me, well, what's going on here, and how would you enter that chamber? If we're going to, because it looks right now like it's just in solid bedrock. There's no entrance to it. And no, I don't believe that the entrance is behind this. A lot of people say, oh, it's behind this stela. There's the stela. You see it there? Okay. What I think is the case for this entrance of this chamber is we did some seismic lines along here too. What we found is that where there's a bunch of sand at the moment, it's not really just sand. There's a cliff face here. So you've got the cliff face here, you've got the Sphinx, and this is technically the Valley Temple, the Sphinx Temple is here. But you've got the temples here, you've got the Sphinx here, you've got the chamber under the paw here. Is that making sense to everyone? And what I believe is, here's from the stela, that at one time, now, so we're talking thousands and thousands of years ago, pre-dynastic times, this cliff face was evident. People would come up, the Nile may have been closer, you'd come up and you would look up the cliff, you would see the temple, you'd see the Sphinx looming above it. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I think that the entrance into these now underground, well, they were then too, was probably in that cliff face. So I think the entrance was probably in that cliff face. Lo and behold, in recent years, the Egyptian government has started to excavate in this area. I gave them all the data. Of course, they would never admit they would excavate there because I suggested that would be a good place to excavate. But I think that's what's going on with that. Just some other confirmation for the age of the Sphinx before I move on to other things. This is the step pyramid. This is step pyramid at Saqqara. I'm not going to talk about that now, but what is interesting at Saqqara is you have these mud brick mastabas. Do you see how beautifully preserved they are? This is a foot ruler I put in there for scale. These are dried, sun-dried mud brick. They're not fired. What happens to mud brick when rain touches it? It disintegrates. Disintegrates very easily. You saw how weathered the Sphinx is? If you had rain like that, would it not destroy these? It would. Absolutely would destroy these. These are in Saqqara, say 10 miles from the Sphinx. These are dated by Egyptologists based on a slew of data, artifacts, radiocarbon, etc., to the early dynasties, say 2800 or 2900 BC, first, second dynasty. The Sphinx, remember, the traditional date is what? Not 3500. That's the beginning of civilization. The Sphinx is 2500. The Egyptologists tell me these are older than the original Sphinx, and I say that's impossible geologically. Unless, as one geologist said to me as a joke, that you can explain the heavy water erosion on the Sphinx because the Sphinx always had a black cloud sitting above it and nowhere else. But obviously he was joking. Wasn't there used to be a cartoon and one character always had a black cloud above him? Yeah. Yeah. Lil Abner? Pete? I don't know. You can talk about cartoons later. I don't know. Yeah. Another line of evidence, and this really is a clincher, at least from other geologists' points of view when I've talked about it, is that the water runoff and a quarry. So the water ran off, among other things, from up higher on the plateau, ran down the back, caused this heavy weathering that we see. So some of it was rain directly down, some was runoff. Everyone follow? And what you had here, this is the Sphinx. The water on the plateau, paleohydrologically, ran basically this way down. So this is north, from the northwest to the southeast. So it ran down and it fell over the back walls of the Sphinx. It ran down the sides and caused a real mess for the poor Sphinx. You can see that here. This has actually opened up that channel because of all the runoff. And this was filled in Old Kingdom times. Now, why did they have to fill that in Old Kingdom times if the Sphinx itself was only Old Kingdom? Just like some of these repairs, Zahi Hawass told me they're definitely Old Kingdom repairs. I asked him, well, doesn't that then sort of demonstrate that the Sphinx is older if it had to be repaired in Old Kingdom times? His answer was, no, it's just rotten rock. More or less, they carved it and it weathered a foot to 3 feet immediately. Yeah, when I say immediately, okay, 5 years. Doesn't happen in a desert, showing water erosion. It just doesn't make sense. But you have this, so you can reconstruct the paleohydrology of it and the water runoff. This is a very important diagram. Here's the Sphinx. Do you see the 2 pyramids, the 3rd pyramid's here? Water's running off this way, as I said, running down the back. What is this? This is the quarry, one of the major quarries that they took limestone from to build the Great Pyramid. According to Egyptologists, the Great Pyramid is older than the Sphinx. Once they quarried this, it stopped the water runoff. Even if there had been water in early Sahara times, it would have stopped it. Everyone follow? And so even if you forget about deserts, forget about climates, even if it had been raining ever since for the last 5,000 years on the plateau, this would stop the runoff. It would not cause the heavy runoff you have here, and it would demonstrate that this must have been here, weathering with that runoff before the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, was constructed. Does that make sense? Yes. It reverses the chronology. I mean, they have so many things wrong. And other geologists have confirmed this, that as one geologist said to me, when you look at this data, it's not a matter of is the Sphinx older than the Great Pyramid, it's a matter of how much older it is. I mean, it's so, really diagnostic. So a lot of things. And there you can see that you've seen this already, or a version of it. You see the quarry there? How it would just stop the runoff. So bottom line is a lot of data demonstrating that the Sphinx is older. I won't dwell on a lot of other silly things, like one geologist said, oh yeah, the Sphinx is older, Shoch is right, but it's not really older, it's just the weathering that's older, because in fact it was a natural, what is called a yardang. It was natural weathering of a hill that was there, so you get incredibly old weathering. Then later they said, oh, this hill sort of looks like a what? Sphinx, and they came and they chipped away and sort of turned it into a sphinx, like you turn a natural rock feature into a face on a mountain. Yes. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, so that would make sense. That would explain the older weathering, but it means that the Sphinx as a human construction is not really that old. So it's sort of a compromise. Yeah, Shoch is right, but he misinterpreted the situation, and he's really wrong. But his geology is right. What they forgot was the Sphinx sits in a what? Enclosure. And if this theory was right about the ancient weathering being natural, it's really strange weathering, because I guess the wind and the rain and whatnot was not just weathering here, but it was carving out huge blocks, moving them and reassembling them to build a temple. Yeah, it's really ludicrous. So it's too carved small for the body. Can you see the proportions? I think this is, I just showed this one. It's actually from a video. Well, when I say a video, it's from The Mystery of the Sphinx, the video that we did in 1993 movie. But I think it shows nicely the small head. Originally, it may have been a Sphinx. One can't totally exclude that. I don't believe so. I believe it was a lion. Yeah, there's lots of reasons. I mentioned one already, why it might be a lion. So I was pushing the Sphinx back to a much earlier period. This upset a lot of people. People were saying, oh, would rewrite history, et cetera. I actually never saw it as rewriting history. I simply saw it as pushing history further back. I naively, I'm not joking about this, I naively thought there was at least a 50 to 60% chance that the Egyptologists would embrace this, because it would mean they'd have so much more to study. You know, I knew there was a little risk going into it. A few might get upset, but I didn't think all of them would, or so vehemently. And so then it set off all this rage, etc. Now this is the height in some ways of, I don't know what's the height of. I mean, it's infamy, I guess, in academic circles, because I first presented this officially at I think it was October or November, somewhere in there, late 1991 at Geological Society of America, which is a huge conference, of international conference actually, even though it's held in America and sponsored by the American Society. I presented it, made news around the world. People thought it was great that these people were geologists, of course. Egyptologists didn't think it was so great. They basically ganged up and said, we've got to do something about Shoch and this crazy theory. So within months, unprecedented as far as I know, within months, there was coming up the American Association for the Advancement of Science annual meeting. They got it together to have a special debate on the age of the Sphinx on February 7th, 1992, just a few months after I first presented it. And we were supposed to debate it. This is actually me and Tom DeBecke. This is Mark Lehner, the Egyptologist, and Kay Lau Gowrie, a guy, geoarchaeologist, they call him, basically a guy that's paid to support the Egyptologists. I'm serious. And we were supposed to debate the age of the Sphinx. It turned out very quickly that it wasn't much of a debate. It was really, I was trying to present data. I could tell you very detailed stories some other time about how Mark Lehner didn't want to hear the data, how certain people on the Egyptological side couldn't understand what they were looking at or interpret. And this was supposed to be the clincher from Egyptologist Mark Lehner. He said this, and it was reported by the New York Times. If the Sphinx was built by an earlier culture, where's the evidence of that civilization? Where are the pottery shards? People during that age were what? Hunters and gatherers. It couldn't be, you know? Remember the paradigm? They didn't build cities, because of course the Sphinx would imply a city with its temple, etc. So that was supposed to shut me up. But I had a problem. And he said, well, where are the pottery shards? Where's there more evidence? And you have to start somewhere, is how I've always felt. The first dinosaur was once found. If everyone dismissed the first evidence for something, would we ever get anywhere? That was my feeling. So I felt very sure of it. But this is 1992, and realistically, there wasn't a lot of evidence for early civilization going back to this, we'll call it antediluvian period, this very early period. But I figured there must be. Now, fast forward. This is now Turkey. This is myself in 2010 with Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute. And dates are important. 1995, 3 years after the AAAS debate, where they wanted to. I also realized, and again, I'm not trying to sound the wrong way about myself, but I realized if it had not been 1992, it had been 1600, they would have done what? Yeah, burnt me at the stake like they did Bruno. I deserved it. By their standards, I deserved it. I understand that. I mean, I'm an academic. I understand that. By their standards, I deserved it. So they didn't. But the best thing they could do is try to shut me up and try to humiliate me and whatnot. They didn't actually think I would persist at that point. So this is 3 years later. So this was not even known about by anyone at the time in 1992. He comes, 1995, he starts excavating the site. It really doesn't become well known for at least another 10 years plus, even to the inner circle of archaeologists. It's called Göbekli Tepe. It's near Şanlı Urfa, or Urfa, which is the traditional home of the biblical Abraham. People have heard of Abraham, I'm sure, the founder of the great, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, not obviously in that order, in southeast Turkey. And lo and behold, he's dating it to Sphinx time, what I've been calling Sphinx time, 10,000 to 8,000 BC, and it is incredibly sophisticated. It is in Mesopotamia between the Euphrates and Tigris, but not down here, up here in the north, which is actually, if you read the Bible in certain interpretations of the Bible, that's where Eden is. I just point that out. I'm not Abraham, Eden. I'm not saying it really has anything to do with biblical stuff, but it's sort of interesting, isn't it? Yeah. You can come. Oh, and you can come see this with us next summer. As Katie and I are doing another trip there where we're inviting people. We've been there a number of times. Most of these photos, as I said before, were taken by Katie. But what they're uncovering there are these stone enclosures or stone circles. Sort of like Stonehenge, but if you've seen Stonehenge is really crude compared to these. These are beautifully carved. They've got reliefs on them. There's Katie, just to prove she was there taking pictures. And look at this. Do you see the little fox on it or whatever it is? The lion. They're beautifully carved. I don't have time to talk about it in great detail, but this entire site was covered over by 8,000 BC. I'll cut to the chase. And before they covered over, apparently there was destruction. Things fell down. Do you see how this pillar was re-erected? That's not modern reconstruction. They did that prior to 8,000 BC. So there was catastrophe here. There was damage to the site. I want to point that out now. And they tried to hastily reconstruct it. Do you see these walls? These are secondary walls, but still 10,000 plus years old, because all of it was covered by 8,000 BC. It's just a pretty site. Isn't that beautiful? This is carved in the round. This particular one, this is about, close to 12,000 years old. Yeah, if the archaeologists had found this in isolation, they just find it on the surface, how old would they think it is?
3,500 or less.
Yes, exactly right. By definition, it had to be 3,500 or less. A lot have said to me off the record, they think it was maybe 1,000 BC. Yeah. not 10,000 BC or close to 10,000 BC. Look at these carvings. Okay, I'm just going to go through these quickly just to give you a sense of it. If you really want to see more of it, you know what you can do, right? Yeah, you can come with me and we'll go. But I mentioned this already. It was intentionally buried following a catastrophe. I mean, you have evidence of catastrophic damage to it. And look at this. These are secondary walls, but ancient walls. They were not meant initially to cover the reliefs. So things are going on here, which is part of our story in a few minutes. No, that's not me. Sometimes people ask. But this gives you a sense of the height of the pillars. And look at this. Look at how they reconstructed that hastily before they packed it in. So it's very interesting. Here we're actually talking about the dating, because I went there and I was very skeptical. This is John Anthony West. He came with us on the first trip to it. Because you can see, do you see how this confirms what we've been talking about all these years? If this had been known in 1992 at the debate, could they have criticized me the way they did? No. Just a few details. It was all covered over by 8000 BC. That has to do with minerals that developed since then, basically microstalactites and stalagmites that you can date. The totem pillars are ornately carved in relief. Some of them have arms and hands. Do you see that? And look at this belt. I mean, these were sophisticated people 12,000 years ago. And a loincloth. I don't want to sound sexist or the wrong way about some of my, how should I say, I teach at Boston University, but some of my undergraduates, mostly the female ones, they've looked at this and they say that's like a designer belt, a modern designer belt with a buckle on it. See that? I mean, it's really incredible. It shouldn't exist back then. Also very interesting, these pillars, do you see how they're very tall and thin? That's a lot harder to work than a big chunky pillar. And when they initially were uncovering this, they figured about a third of the pillar should be set in the bedrock or set in the ground. It turns out, you see how shallow they're set? What is going on here? They may have vibrated, actually. And they may have had a roof or secondary structure later on top, but there's a lot of evidence that they were freestanding initially. And if you know anything about obelisks in Egypt, do they vibrate? Yeah. So it may have been a vibrational type of thing. There's, I think, a lot of sophistication going on that we really don't understand yet. Just some more pictures there. The Fox Point loincloth, possibly indicative of a hunter with no head. I'll jump to that right now. What's a hunter with no head in the sky? Orion. If you know the constellation Orion. Yeah, and the zodiac belt, exactly. Turns out, I'll get it to in 2 seconds, there's an Orion correlation here. This is Urfa man, who was found in Urfa, but dates back to the same period. Turns out the city of Urfa, which is 500,000 or more people now, may be one of the oldest inhabited cities on Earth. Because when they build streets or they do build an underground garage, that type of thing, they find things like Urfa man. They find settlements that go back to 10,000 BC or more. Incredible archaeological site, but there's a bunch of people living there now too. Plus it's a holy site to Christians, to Muslims, etc., because of the Abraham and other prophets that came from there. These are all found at Göbekli Tepe. Is that incredible? They call this a totem pole sometimes.
Do you know which circle that came out of?
Yeah, it's it actually came out of not A, B, C, or D. It came out of, I'm picturing it, it's just above A. It's another one. And it's probably secondarily there that came out of, because they were reused, being reused. And A, for those that, here, I'll come back to that. These are all from Göbekli Tepe. They're now in the museum. This is a map of 4 of the major enclosures. And when you orient it, this is now north now. This is enclosure A. Enclosure A is the youngest of these 4. We can establish that on several bases. So it goes older, less old, still youngest. This has the smallest, and it's been reworked. And apparently some of these pillars may have been used in older structures, and that, if I remember correctly, the Totem Pole came from up in here, but it's probably been reworked, as you see in a lot of these sites. You see that at Navali Quarry too, for instance, like that head with the snake on it is reworked. It was actually found in the walls as older. So they were using these structures and reusing them until, the ultimate catastrophe hit, which I'll get to. Orion, I want to mention here. Do you see how they're oriented slightly differently? I put these black lines in. This is my analysis now, not Schmidt's. And the hands with on the belly shows which way they face. They face to the south and slightly east. What were they facing? I believe they were facing Orion on the vernal equinox. They would have been facing exactly where Orion, the region of Orion, was rising on the vernal equinox. So there you have it. And it turns out that they were reorienting them over time because of precession. People know what precession is? Precessional changes, slight shifts in the stars. This is something that supposedly, according to conventional historians of astronomy, no one knew about precession or paid attention to it until the Greeks in maybe the 3rd, 2nd century BC, or possibly the Babylonians 600 BC, but certainly not 10,000, 9,000 BC. Again, level of sophistication, what they're doing here, this is not trivial. And this just to show you a little bit. Now they would see Orion rising over the horizon. This is looking essentially south, I got to orient myself, southeast. And so Orion, as we said, is sometimes described as a headless hunter, and as you may be aware, the zodiac is basically a ring of animals, and it essentially was within the ring of animals, which is sort of what we see with the ring of animals on the pillars around it. So yeah, and travels with its companion dog. One of them has sort of a dog under its arm, and yeah, the Orion has its arms up here, but how are you going to carve that on a pillar? And to me, it's logical they brought them down. So anyway, I throw that out for your amusement. Jumping to Easter Island. This ties in. I know it's a quick transition, but everyone's heard of Easter Island? No. Yeah, who's been there? A couple of you have been there. Katie and I were married there. You can read about that in Forgotten Civilization, and we've been there back since. But it too, I think, demonstrates advanced and sophisticated technology. Easter Island, I think, is another place where archaeologists, conventional historians have greatly underestimated its age. It's known for the moai, the big heads and torsos, and it's just a beautiful island. I'm just going to show a few. There I am, actually next to a fairly small one. There, some of them lined up. Do you see me in the picture? That's me, for scale. And what do they have? They have the arms and the, does that look familiar? And the thumbs, and there's Katie. And this has made the internet a little while ago. Oh, how they have bodies under the heads. Well, this has been known for a long time. This was actually excavated in the early 20th century, about 100 years ago. Everyone where they have some that are up to their shoulders or necks, chins in sediment, when you uncover them, there's a full torso there. Not legs, but down to this region. Remember Urfa Man? Doesn't have the legs either, but has the hands from the same positions. This was excavated in the 1950s by Thor Heyerdahl. People have heard of him? Yeah, and as he pointed out, you get up to 6 meters or so of sediment. That's not what you get in 1,500 years. Conventional archaeologists think these things are only 1,500 years or so old at the most. I don't believe that. I believe we're talking thousands and thousands of years, again, going back potentially to the same period. And I have many reasons for believing that, which I am not going to try to detail now. But again, it's another anomaly. Oh, some people, I will say this, sometimes conventional historians say, oh yeah, well they were filled in because, tsunamis came and just threw all the sediment over them, what would that do to it? Knock it down, or if you had landslide, knock it down. Or then sometimes they say, oh, they dug a hole purposefully and stuck it in. Busy work, as Katie and I were told. They carve these things and then they bury them immediately just to keep the people busy. There's actually no geological evidence that these were being purposefully buried. Yeah. Some of them are very strange looking. But again, this is sometimes referred to as a female moai. Do you see the arms and positioning? Very similar. You have these petroglyphs. Do you see the hands there? And then this is referred to as the bird man. You see another one there? Okay, I'm going to tie this back in. And then Easter Island is known for the Rongo script. Have people heard about that before? Yeah, it's an indigenous script of Easter Island. Very strange that this little island, it's a tiny little island. You can walk around it in 2 days. Literally walk the coast in 2 days. And it's got this indigenous script, sort of hieroglyphic type script that to this day no one has deciphered unless Katie and I have figured it out, which I think we have, at least the roots of it. And I mentioned similarities to Göbekli Tepe, and I think this all ties together. And I like these guys. This is Urfaman and the little Easter Island moai. This was on our first trip to Urfa. If you remember, now they painted the background sort of orange to set it off, yeah. But what you do is you get a lot of similarities. For instance, here is one of the pillars from Göbekli Tepe. Do you see this vulture-type bird? And here is one of the Rongo scripts. Here is a Birdman on Easter Island. And when Katie and I have been looking at this, we see, and other people, more and more similarities between them. I think there's a commonality here. And I think it has to do with another phenomenon that I need to get into for just a few minutes. This is Dr. Anthony Perrott. He is a plasma physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And if you don't know what plasma is, we're not talking blood plasma, we're talking high electrical discharges. And he has studied for decades and written numerous scientific papers on plasma discharges, wrote the classic manual or text on plasma discharges. And his interest, and I've met him first in 2000, have corresponding with him since and talked to him since. His real interest initially was looking at plasma phenomena in space. Because what are the 3 states of matter? Gas, liquid, solid, and the 4th is often referred to as plasma. Plasma actually occurs, for instance, in fluorescent tubes, that type of thing. Flame, burning, spontaneous combustion, I guess, is technically plasma. But plasma is a very common phenomenon when you look at the universe as a whole, and you get huge plasma discharges from things like stars. Our sun is a type of star. You get plasma discharges between different astronomical bodies. You get it at galactic levels. So he's been studying these types of things. As a sort of hobby, this just shows some plasma in the laboratory, essentially like a fluorescent tube. And what he picked up on as a hobby, really I want to say about late 90s, because he first told me about this in 2000 at a conference, is he was looking just for fun at ancient petroglyphs, carvings on stones, in the Southwest and the American West, that type of thing. And he noticed that not all of them, because some of them are different, but a bunch of them, which seemed to be very, very old petroglyphs, looked a lot like incredibly intense plasma discharge patterns. That's the way I'll say it now. That this looked like what you would have if you had a huge plasma discharge from one astronomical body to another. Does that make sense? And he started looking at this and finding all kinds of diagnostic features. And he started looking at this with his team, his group, around the world, and found that these ancient petroglyphs seem to model the diagnostic features of plasma discharges that you would see in the sky, to get to the bottom line here, if the sun gave off huge balls of plasma, essentially electrical charged particles that might hit us. Now, it does that a little bit all the time, and we see that as what? Northern and southern lights, aurora borealis, aurora australis, but we don't see huge ones. There was an event in 1859, and I talk about this in Forgotten Civilization, the 1859 Carrington Event, when there was a mild one from an astrophysical point of view, and it caused essentially lights in the sky, plasma discharges, what people described as dancing stick figures in the sky we're seen around the world. Sure, they have extra arms, they have these little balls on the side of themselves. He said this is not what people really look like, but this is sure what plasma discharges in the sky would look like during a major solar outburst. You have this in over 130 countries around the world. You find these. It's not just that everyone was on the same drugs and hallucinating the same things. They were seeing the same things in the sky. Plus, you get other types of figures. So you not only get sort of the stick figures with the dots on their sides, they look like humans. You get stick figure men that seem to have bird heads. Very common theme in a lot of ancient cultures, and to this day, bird-headed men or birdmen. And you get sort of what we call cascading donut-like cylindrical shapes, like this, and you find those around the world. Here's more examples. These are from Dr. Perrott. And again, one very diagnostic thing, people don't really have these weird things, but that's what you would get in plasma. It's referring to synchrotron radiation. But that's what you would see in the sky. And these weird things, and look, bird-headed man type thing. Yeah. So there's more of them, just to give you a feel for that. And again, think of the aurora borealis, but much further. He was not the first one to be talking about this. Thomas Gold, he's now deceased, but he was at Cornell University, a very famous astrophysicist in his time. He won all kinds of awards, that type of thing. But every once in a while, according to his colleagues, he would go out on these weird limbs and just get into total nonsense. So for instance, in the 1960s, he started talking about at one point how the sun, our sun, is just a normal star like other stars. Every once in a while, it can sort of go crazy. It can get agitated, to use anthropomorphic terms, or it can destabilize and have to re-equilibrate and spit out balls of plasma, electrically charged particles. And if that happened in the case of a big solar outburst, the Earth's magnetic field could clearly not hold up the incoming gas, he wrote. The plasma or the charged particles, that's what he's referring to as gas in this context, would indeed drive down to the atmospheric level. It would take the form of a series of sparks. So think of like huge lightning in certain areas hitting, burning to extended periods of time and carrying currents of hundreds of millions of amperes. And he talked about how it would cause massive destruction in certain places. It would melt glaciers if it hit a glacier. It would evaporate water on contact. It would set forest fires. He suggested that you could look for places where rock would be incinerated or melted and then coagulate, vitrification. I talk about that in the book. I won't talk about today. So he even talked about what you should find and what the evidence would be. People laughed him out. Now we're finding the evidence, I believe. So getting back to the Rongo-Rongo, you see how I'm tying this together? It turns out that the Rongo-Rongo, we were looking at, when I say we, Katie and I, we're looking at some videos. I was thinking about Perrott's work. I'm thinking about the mysteries of antiquity. One big question is, if you have this earlier civilization, why did it collapse? Where did it go? What happened to it? I think there was a major catastrophe. And then Katie was looking at the Rongo-Rongo, and she notices that the Rongo-Rongo characters, guess what? Match the petroglyphs and the plasma configuration. So one thing I wanted to suggest to you now, which I've become convinced of, is that the origin of the Rongo-Rongo was the same phenomenon, looking up in the sky, seeing these incredible plasma configurations that were causing massive destruction on Earth, and to cut to the chase, end of the last ice age, because I'm going to finish up here in a few minutes. But you get these distinct shapes. We put this together. These are rongoglyphs. These are petroglyphs. These are the pinch instabilities, is another way of saying it, the plasma configurations. Do you see the similarities? The bird-headed men. Look at this, rongo, the petroglyphs, the plasma. Here is experimental plasma. There's rongo. I mean, what is that otherwise? I mean, no one's been able to explain what these things are supposed to be, but I think they fit right in. Again, here, look at the rongo compared to the experimental plasma. I think this is even a better match than some of the petroglyphs. And it's really a good match, I think. And the Easter Islanders, I found this in one of the ethnologies. They even talk about things happening in the sky as part of their legends. When we went to Easter Island on one of our trips, one of the natives, I'll call them natives, they're all interbred now, but you know, he had his generations of family had talked about how they had to go underground because things were happening on the surface. They were, you know, something was happening and they had to escape underground. How would you escape from a plasma event underground? But one of the legends talks about how in the days of Roko Hital, the sky fell. I think they were talking about a plasma outburst. Fell from above onto the earth. The people cried out, the sky has fallen. In the days of King Roko Hital, he took hold, he waited a given time, the sky returned, it went away, and it stayed up there. Well, this is what happened during a plasma outburst. It would only last so long, then it would go away. Actually, it would come again, then go away, and then slowly die down. You just live it out. How do you escape it? You go underground. So maybe they're looking up at the sky, in part, because of what's happening. Now, so Perrott talks about evidence for intense solar outburst in prehistory, but he doesn't have a date for it. I think it has to do with Göbekli Tepe times, what I think is probably original Easter Island time, and the end of the last ice age. The last ice age, just to get into it a little bit here, and remember Atlantis and Plato? What did we say the dating of Plato's Atlantis was?
654 BC.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so about 9600, 9700 BC. The end of the last ice age is actually best date geologically now, 9700 BC. This is very, very firm date. It's arguably within 5 years based on sediment cores and ice cores, which you can date layer by layer. And there's a huge global warming at that time. What could cause a global warming? Solar outbursts, plasma discharge, melting things, causing climate changes, causing disruptions. And this is when Göbekli Tepe seems to suffer a catastrophe, and they're trying to rebuild it quickly, and then eventually they cover it all over. Just to set things straight, before you have the ice age collapse and warm up, there's actually a colder period known as the Younger Dryas. That begins at 10,900 BC. So there's a cold snap, then an incredible warming snap. What's going on here? There's this 1,200-year period bounded of very cold weather. A lot of evidence you may have heard about that meteorite or comet or something hit the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere about 10,900 BC, but that is a different event. And even professional scientists get things mixed up sometimes. Yeah, I know. Just a few pictures. This is Ice Age versus modern. Ice Age versus modern, although Katie has pointed out that this wouldn't have all been desert like that. And this is from NASA, I think. Even they make mistakes. Yeah. Our huge expanses, this is from one of my earlier books. Huge expanses were flooded by the rising what? Water, sea levels. Why? Because you would melt all those glaciers, right? With the rising temperatures. Also, as water gets warmer, it what? Expands. I don't know if you know, just ocean expansion caused part of the sea level rise. And here's a diagram from environmental science textbook I co-authored with some of my colleagues a few years ago. But this shows cold ice age conditions. It was starting to warm up, but then in 10,900 BC, it got dramatically cold. Then 9,700 BC, really warm again. So you have to account for these two events, cold and warm. And the bottom line for me is, oh yes, I just want to point this out. This is data. This was published in the journal Science, published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, who tried to go after me in 1992. American Association for the Advancement of Science. Now they seem to be corroborating at least some of my theories. When I say them, they're publishing papers. But this talks about, I don't expect you to read it, just high-resolution Greenland ice core data showing abrupt climate change in a few years. And they talk about how it's within 1 to 3 year period. It actually could be even shorter because that's the best resolution you have. And what kind of climate change are they talking about? They're talking about the end of the last ice age, 9,700 BC. That all of a sudden, there's this immediate change which they can't explain because it happens virtually instantaneously, which sounds to me like the type of event I'm talking about. And as I said, there's also evidence of something at 10,900 BC where you have abrupt coldness. And I talked about that. And this is where another place people can make mistakes, scientists. This was in Science News. Ice age ends smashingly. Did a comet blow up over eastern Canada? They're talking the 10,900 BC event. That's not the end of the last ice age. That actually threw us back into a cold period. Everyone follow me? And then you get warm at 9,700 BC. So a lot, I don't mean to beat this into the ground, but a lot of people are confusing these two events, both among the popular writers, general public, and professional scientists. There are two different events going on here. I talk about this, or I predicted this actually in this earlier book of mine. So what we have here so far is origin, traditional beginning of civilization. These all push further back. Sphinx is certainly older. Göbekli Tepe is older than the beginning of civilization according to traditional chronology. You have a final warming here, 9,700 BC, but you have a cold snap even further back. I suspect that a comet or meteor or something hit about 10,900 BC. There's a lot of evidence for that. Something happened that put dust in the upper atmosphere, would have caused cooling. That's what you would expect. And then this dramatic warming. And this dramatic warming is even more dramatic and faster than the cooling event. 1,200 years later, you have this warming. And I think the only good explanation for that is the sun. And we now know, as I've already been explaining, that the sun undergoes major solar outbursts. It's like any other star. It's a plain old star. There's nothing special about our sun. I hate to delude you. Yeah, just like there's nothing special about the Earth. Remember, once the Earth was the center of the universe, and then the sun became the center of the universe, or the solar system. Now it turns out neither is the center of the universe, but up until really today, for most people, and I say scientists, they somehow still see the sun as a special star that is always nice and stable and amenable to us. Well, no, yeah. But no, it's probably just an ordinary star. It goes through cycles, 11-year sunspot cycles, up to what I believe is a 10 to 12,000 year cycle of instability, restabilizing by essentially having explosions coming from the interior, which we see as plasma discharges. And these would cause massive destruction on the Earth. It can end an ice age. We've got all this data from ice core data, sediment core. We have vitrification now. I mentioned that before. Evidence of incineration of rock surfaces and flash melting and then recongealing, forming glass. Actually, some of the legends of glass castles, I talk about this in Forgotten Civilization. Have people heard of glass castles? Arthurian legends may actually have been inspired by this. They were glass castles, but not glass like this, pretty glass, but geologic glass that was vitrified. And the date of this intense solar outburst that they independently concluded, I think, they couldn't date it, I think that's 9700 BC. Yeah, so you know the story now. And I think when it all comes down to it, the traditional date for civilization, this is not the origin of civilization. This is a re-emergence of civilization, as the ancients from that period always said it was. They always said that there had been an earlier civilization, thousands of years earlier. I think that's represented by the remains of the Great Sphinx, probably the Great Lion at the time, not a Sphinx, Göbekli Tepe, and this was wiped out by the catastrophes of the last ice age, this much earlier civilization, or we'll call it previous round of civilization. Yes, some people survived. Oh, I've already said this already. Basically, the solar outburst could incinerate everything. It would cause massive destruction. What would survive a huge solar outburst physically? Rock, big rock structures. What do we see from the very, very ancient period? Pyramids and big rock structures for two reasons, I think. Some, I think, are really old and came from that period. Secondly, there was a memory for a long time of what happened. So what do you build to survive when it happens again? Big rock structures. So I think it works both ways. What did we have in this country and may have to have again? Everyone had in their backyard, I'm told at one point, in case there was a nuclear war, bomb shelters. Yeah, do you see what I mean? So I think there was this heritage. So we've got these very old structures. We're also finding, as I mentioned with Easter Island, we're finding those with things like Stonehenge. Are a lot of these older structures misdated? And they're actually much older. And just because you find a campfire from 3500 BC doesn't necessarily prove that the structure is only 3500 BC, because they were reusing things, just as we reuse things now. I sometimes point out my students to make it very clear. You could have a great cathedral, one of the European cathedrals from the Middle Ages, right? And 10,000 years from now, they excavate it and they find a coin from 2014. That doesn't mean the cathedral was built in 2014. So, simple example. But I really think we need to rethink a lot of this. Also, it would create one of the stories that we find around the world is huge coming down? Water, rains, floods, rising. Well, this would tie in because when you melt those glaciers, you have fire hitting water and evaporating it. You can only put so much in the atmosphere. It has to come down as rain again. So you have the biblical floods, deluges, just crazy. What was weathering the Sphinx? Water. So maybe it ties in there. I think so at this point. If it goes back to that period, referring to Göbekli Tepe, remember they buried everything by 8000 BC. I think that it was just going crazy. They were trying to survive. They were trying to rebuild, perhaps. But what you would get is you would get a solar outburst, then it would let up for a while, then it would happen again, let up for a while, happen again. And I think it got to be too much. And I don't want to say they gave up. We can argue about this. Did they bury it thinking they were coming back? Did they bury it for us to find, more or less posterity? I don't know. But they certainly took a lot of time and energy to bury it. And as Schmidt has said publicly and to me privately, they took as much energy, not the same level of sophistication, but they took incredible amount of energy to build a mountain essentially over the site and protect it and preserve it. Remember I showed how they re-erected pillars before they buried it to say this is the position of them, this is important, there's information encoded here. And some people did survive. How would you survive? You'd have to seek shelter in thick stone buildings, caves, and underground, and we have evidence of this too. Archeologists have commented naively, it's really strange. A lot of these very early sites are associated with caves. both natural and artificial. Some have commented, why would they go through all this effort to build these thick stone structures to carve into underground? And again, some of these might be later, but it might be they were building them in case it happened again. What do we have on Easter Island? We have these weird artificial houses. Sometimes people, conventional archaeologists will tell you, oh, they're protecting themselves from their enemies. Yeah, go look at this. What's your enemy going to do? They're just going to keep you in there until you starve. Yeah, block the doorway. And it's not mortared or anything, so if they want to get to you quicker, they just pull it apart as you're sitting there waiting for them. I mean, it's ridiculous. And we have these caves on Easter Island. Just giving you some examples. This is going into them. And these were made, for instance, this is a lava tube cave, but he's sitting on an artificial bench. They were living under there. And that's what we were told when we were there. You get this around the world, built in shelters or under cliff faces. Cappadocia, if you come to Turkey with us, we'll go into some of these. It's an incredible area where they were carving into the rock and living underground. You have things like the Kamakali underground city. This is one of numerous cities where they're going down, and I mean, these are incredibly sophisticated. Jennifer's nodding her head because you've been there. It's unbelievable. And they're doing this for a reason, and I don't think it has anything to do with hiding from their enemies, because you just find the entrances to it in the air vents, and you just starve them, keep them in. But it would protect you from solar outbursts. And yes, some of these were then used later and turned to Christian purposes, etc. But do we use and reuse things? Yes. So just because they were used later doesn't disprove that they go back, their origins are much earlier. This I wanted to throw in, mapping the origins and expansion of the Indo-European language. This is also now published in Science. See, they're becoming my friends now. But this is a linguistic study, and it goes back essentially just after the end of the last ice age. They're mapping language families and the origin of language families. Turns out that a lot of these languages originate where? Turkey. Where we're talking about, we had a huge end of the last ice age catastrophe, a few survivors underground there that survived and then spread out later, that would show origin to that region. So I think this is all corroborating the big picture. I think it really puts a lot of loose, diverse pieces together into a cogent whole, and called a cogent entity. I won't get into this now, but I think that we talked about the Rongo. Rongo may be a very specific record of what was happening in the skies at the time. Now, I want to say that this doesn't preclude that later Rongo was used for more mundane purposes once they had the idea of writing things out. But I think it originates with these plasma events. And no, these are not 10,000 years old. The tablets we have now are not 10,000 years old. They're copies of copies of copies. But if you know anything about Plato, for instance, do we have original manuscripts going back to Plato's time? No. I think it was half the dialogues of Plato. We have nothing older than maybe 1,000 years or something like that. But no one doubts that they're real. 1859, I mentioned that the Carrington Event was a very small one. It wiped out the telegraph lines of the time. If we had a Carrington Event now, all our lights would go down, our communications would go off, we would be mass panic in the technological world. What happened at the end of the last ice age was orders of magnitude more than a Carrington Event. If that happened now, I mean, it would just be, you can't even think about the implications. Well, you can think about it, but I don't want to right now. Could it happen again? Logical question? Of course. Never mind. One thing that I learned as an undergraduate in geology, and I always thought this was very interesting, is that geology looks at vast expanses of time. We as humans, even with human history, we look at very short periods of time which typically are not typical, if I could put it that way. You can't extrapolate from the last 300 years or 500 years or even last 3,000 years and expect to get a clear picture of things geologically. Am I making sense? Yeah. When we start looking, this is based on isotope data. This is essentially solar activity based on isotope data, which is a good proxy for solar activity. Has to do with radioactive nucleotides, not nucleotides, radioactive nuclides, radioactive elements that are formed from solar outbursts. And this is solar activity, and look how high it was. This is at the end of the last ice age and right afterwards. Both high, and look at the variability. It'd be really high, then really low, then really high again. You see that? The sun is going crazy. It can't make up its mind. It's going through these huge, if you think anthropomorphically, mood swings. This is what was happening at the end. This would have been incredibly devastating to those early civilizations, and it would like knock you down, and then you think everything is calm and you're starting to rebuild a little bit, then you get smashed again. See my point? So that's the pattern you see. Then eventually it calms down, and since about this is 5,000 BC, 4,000, 3,000, you see how it sort of calmed down? And it's much smoother, much low activity, just a nice sun like we've been knowing ever since. And so now civilization finally sort of gets it together and reemerges, and we come up to our wonderful civilization today, high technological civilization. But what's been happening in the last 50 or so years? More sun activity, more mood swings. I don't think this is invalidated by what some people are talking about right now, where they say the sun has sort of gone cold and is becoming inactive. Well, in fact, I think what you get at this type of critical period is incredible activity, then sort of a slouch in activity. It stops for a while, then it's going to go again. So as the sun goes cold, some people are saying, well, maybe we'll go into another little ice age. It could be tomorrow that there's a major solar outburst. I'm a geologist, so I use a geological analogy. Sometimes on fault lines, earthquake zones, you get a little bit of activity, it relieves pressure, a little bit of activity, then it sort of locks up nothing. Is the danger over? No, it's the big one's going to come. And so we may be seeing that in the sun. So I don't know, but I'm telling you as a geologist, looking at long-term cycles, I'm not going to be surprised if the sun has some real major activity in the short-term future. And are we going to be really vulnerable? Yeah, satellites, communications, electrical systems, it's all going to be wiped out. And I won't even go into the parapsychological aspects of how this can influence background radiation, something that's often referred to as geomagnetic storms. Well, that affects our psyche and consciousness, all kinds of things. But I do want to segue into and this, I've got like 2 more slides. Plato talked about Atlantis. Well, he also talked about world ages, the Hindu Yuga cycle. You may have heard of that, the concept of world ages, that we go through cycles of civilization, cycles of consciousness. I think this all ties together. It's been demonstrated, for instance, that radioactivity, decay rates vary with the distance from the sun for certain isotopes. Yeah, this is not supposed to be the case. I talk about it in Forgotten Civilization. They vary in some cases with solar flares, so major solar activity. There are a lot of things that tie together with the sun and with the sort of bigger picture, should we say. We are not isolated here on Earth. I don't think we are isolated as individuals from each other. We're not isolated from our environment. Our environment is not isolated from the bigger solar environment. It's not isolated from the bigger galactic environment. We heard about that earlier today with psychic activity in sidereal time. I mean, so all this is tied together. And the more I look into this, it's not just because every culture around the world traditionally talks about having cycles of culture and cycles of civilization and cycles of consciousness, but I think the real data, hard scientific data, is indicating that is the case too. And with Göbekli Tepe and the original Sphinx, I think we're seeing, the end of a last cycle of civilization. And then we go into this, I'll call it long extended dark age or dark period until civilization reemerges. And some people would say culminates with us at the moment. But we could all crash again, you know. And are we really a culmination? Or what did that earliest civilization or earlier civilizations accomplish? And maybe they accomplished things that are, in my opinion at least, well above and beyond what we've accomplished. Maybe they didn't have the sophisticated technology and computers, but they were doing other things. You know, whether you think in psychically or philosophically or culturally or religiously. Am I making sense? So I think we need to think about these things. So bottom line, though, right now is that we have civilization, I believe high civilization, high culture before the end of the last ice age, and that is enough for at least some academics to want to burn me at the stake without even talking about these other things. So I do deserve it. So now just a few commercials, and then we'll take a few questions if I have time. If you go to my website, we just posted these. So a trip to Egypt in 2015, Turkey in 2015, summer of 2015. We don't have a picture here because you saw a lot of pictures already, but we'll go Göbekli Tepe, Cappadocia. Turkey's wonderful. And then actually going to go to India, that ties in with the Yuga cycles and whatnot, the end of the year. So I'm very excited about this. One last thing, plug. We are organizing. I'm helping to organize, and I invite everyone to get involved. We're calling it Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures, or ORCUL for short, which is, I hate to describe it this way, but it's sort of a shorthand. Everyone's heard of National Geographic? No. Yeah. Okay, National Geographic is very conventional, should we say. You know, carries out funding, research, education, etc. But how mainstream can you get? This is maybe if it blossoms someday, this could be the equivalent. I'd like to get the funding to be the equivalent of National Geographic to carry out alternative cutting-edge research in all these types of areas. So that's another project. You know, we've already established ourselves as a not-for-profit foundation. If you want to make a donation, we can even take donations already, and we're getting there. We're in the infancy, but we're getting there. So if you'd like to be involved, like to make a donation, I put a plug in. I'm not a fundraiser, but I'm told I should say these things. And please get a copy of the book to benefit the Fortean. To benefit info, and if you want to contact us, there's the website. This is Katie's email address. She keeps a mailing list for us, so send her a note if you'd like to be on the mailing list. If you'd like to contact me, you can always do it through her, or I can give you my direct email, or you can look me up at BU website, whatever. So I know I went a little bit over my time, but I was told I was allowed to. So I'm happy to take questions.